in place for very real, very historic reasons. And, this falls sort of into the category of, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And do you throw out all of the historical reasons that the monarchy is in place in order to reinvent our constitutional procedures, etc. And when the problem with that is that when you open up the Constitution for real discussion on that level, well, it opens everything up, and sometimes things are just better left the way they are, even if they seem a little anachronistic and maybe they cost us a little bit of money. And the royal family doesn't cost us much money, but there are real reasons why the monarchy is the way it is, why our Constitution is the way it is, and what we have, Nick, represents the compromises and the settlements that historically we've reached that have ended conflicts, that have reduced conflict in our society, that have produced law and order. And quite frankly, when it comes right down to it, people like to point to the United States and say bastion of freedom. But the truth is that the Americans, like we here in Canada, inherited a particular political culture that was English, that was uniquely English. It was unique in the world. And the roots of what we call freedom today, political freedom today, aren't American. They're English. And somebody once said that the American Revolution was this great liberal event. It wasn't. It was actually a great conservative event, because what the founders of the United States were doing was they were trying to find a way to restore and to safeguard through their own constitutional deliberations the traditional freedoms and liberties that all English men and all English women, but predominant at that time English men, enjoyed, that had been encroached on by a crown, George III, who was blurring in himself the constitutional lines, violating certain constitutional norms in England, and, to be perfectly honest, Parliament itself in England at that time was prepared to be somewhat dictatorial to the colonies, and Americans who enjoyed a certain amount of freedom that they considered was not just their right but their inheritance, rebelled against that. So, in a sense, the American Revolution was a profoundly conservative event, not a liberal event. And so anyway, these are the things, not to get too highfalutin and not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but this is why it's so important to understand the history and to appreciate the rough road, the bumpy road that was traveled to get to where we are, and the dangers that exist when we simply say, well, that's in the past and we don't have to follow that anymore, so let's tear it down and start from scratch because I think we could do a better job of it. Well, maybe we can, but I was brought up with, I think, a healthy dose of self-doubt and even to a degree self-cynicism, and not to be so arrogant as to believe that just because I think it must be right. Here we are circling back to the previous segment again, right? I'd rather be right than consistent, but on this I haven't heard the argument that's strong enough that would compel me to say, okay, let's get rid of the monarchy altogether and let's reinvent our Constitution. Because you and I, Nick, are old enough where we have a pretty good idea of the kind of conflict that can be through no unintentional conflict that could be precipitated by opening up constitutional discussions. And, we didn't have a war in this country, but people tend to forget the old FLQ bombing campaign and how close we came to this country breaking apart, largely because of the tensions that were the result of trying to sit down and redraw what essentially was, flawed though it may be, a settled constitutional framework.
Yeah, you're quite right. And even if it didn't lead to the FLQ crisis, Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accord certainly went nowhere and just showed how difficult a task it is to amend our Constitution in the first place, which in and of itself is a good thing. Because if it's easily amended, it soon won't be worth the paper it's written on. Although there are those who would make that argument today that based, if we look at our society, how closely does it mirror that Constitution? And I think a lot of people would say, well, there's not a lot in there that's reflected in the way we govern ourselves today, because our leadership seems to want to run roughshod if they don't do it outright. Like within the Bill of Rights Constitution / founding documents, we have the right to assembly, free speech, all our rights are encased. And yet the government tramples all over them whenever they want to, and then come up with some pretty fancy excuse about why that's okay and convince a large percentage of the population not to look there, don't go there, nothing to see here, move along. That's troubling in and of itself. So the Constitution and the monarchy that gave it to us, I still say that one of the greatest gifts the British monarchy ever gave us came from Queen Victoria, and that, of course, is the land grant patent, which allows us to defend and protect our property rights from the long arm of government. By telling them, I'm sorry, your authority over my land ends right there at the end of that gate, or at the end of my driveway, or at my property boundaries. You don't have the right. If you don't own it, you can't regulate it. And unless you're willing to buy it from me, you don't own it. So that's where all that comes from. And I don't think nearly enough people realize that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and a freedom of movement of travel, all these things are inherently absolutely necessary to function in a democracy. That's what troubles me about vaccine passports. That's what troubles me about this hate bill. That's what troubles me about a bunch of things that are going on. We have the retired Supreme Court Justice McLaughlin. What's her first name? Beverly McLaughlin, saying that she thinks that we ought to have courts dedicated to what she calls them e-courts, so they can go online and block Canadian access to websites that are hurtful or offensive, or they can pull them down if they're generated here in Canada. And she says, but don't worry, we won't do that very often. Well, I'm sorry, Madam McLaughlin. You shouldn't be pulling any of those down because that's not your job. We live in a society that's built around being able to say what you want and then having to live with the consequences of that, short of calling for outright sedition, insurrection, revolution, or rioting. Those are the kind of things that not really make sense not to allow people to do. Outside of that, they can stand up and say whatever they want. You probably don't remember this, but when I first hit the air in Ottawa, there was still the ripples of deporting a guy called Phil the Nazi, who used to go down and stand in the market and preach National Socialism, the way that Hitler had it defined, to the crowd. And they finally, because he was apparently British or some foreign, belonged to some foreign country, and they extradited him. Or he might have been German, back to Germany to stand trial on hate crime charges. And I think there were some people saying, no, don't extradite him, don't throw him out. let him stand in his box so we know what one of these guys looks like. And that's the best way to defeat them. But he lost, and I haven't heard about him in years, but I remember that case very clearly. And that's a case of when somebody else decides, rather than John Q. Public, what's acceptable and what isn't.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of another segment, part 3. So we're going to take another break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. And if you are listening to the podcast, thanks for joining us. Don't forget to catch tomorrow's podcast, part 4 of this week's episode. If you're listening live, stay put, and we will be back in a few minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show on ThinkRadio.ca.